This video is a critique of the foreign policy school of realism, which recently got a lot of attention in the news media because of the war in Ukraine. Many prominent realists, such as John Mearsheimer and Henry Kissinger, have been giving talks and writing articles since then advocating for an end of Western support for Ukraine. The injection of political opinions in the news is something we're increasingly aware of, but it can be difficult to navigate, which is why I'm a big fan of Ground News. This website and app gathers related articles from thousands of sources in one place and provides context about the sources. On the homepage, you'll see a wide variety of news stories, but what's unique is every story is accompanied by graphs and analysis to show you the political bias, reliability, and ownership of the sources reporting. There are many news stories on Ground News that are an interesting read as an addendum to this video. For example, if you search for Henry Kissinger on Ground News, you will get a list of all the news outlets reporting on Kissinger's calls for negotiations with Russia from 2 months ago. And then you can go through the tabs left, center, and right to see how outlets of different political bias cover and comment on what Kissinger has recently been saying. Interesting here is that Kissinger recently changed his position and now argues for a NATO membership of Ukraine. And you can now again see how different outlets of different bias report on this change of mind. I have used Ground News for half a year now, and by far my favorite feature is their Chrome extension, which pops up whenever I'm reading an article to conveniently show me who else is reporting on it and what the bias distribution is. Then I can just click through and read multiple perspectives on the topic in one place. Ground News is especially useful if you follow a lot of political news and if you are interested in how political biases impact reporting on news. But it is also useful if you wish to be aware of your own biases and consider opposing viewpoints with an open mind. If you're someone like that, you are able to use Ground News specifically to seek out reporting and articles that you disagree with, to honestly challenge your own biases and escape a potential information bubble. If you want to sign up for Ground News yourself, go to ground.news/crowd or use the link in the description. As a frequent user of the platform, I'm confident in recommending it to you and grateful for their continued sponsorship of this channel. Hello, hey. A lot of you liked this video that I made a while ago and you asked me to make another one like it. There's a video that a lot of you requested for a very long time, critiquing realism, Mearsheimer and Chomsky, and here you go, this is it. But it's a bit of a longer one, so get comfortable. When Russia invaded Ukraine, many people began sharing clips of John Mearsheimer, in particular far-left pundits who are critical of an interventionist American foreign policy, which is somewhat funny, but more on that later. Mearsheimer argues in these clips that the fault of the war in Ukraine lies with the Americans for creating an existential threat for Russia by advancing the borders of NATO. Mearsheimer has also been invited to several discussions after the Russian invasion to speak. Mearsheimer is a realist, and it is important to outline here what realism is. I will try to do so objectively, but you are free to point out in the comments if I fail at that. Realism is not an idealistic position or a set of ideological beliefs. Realism is something completely different. Realism is a school of international studies in which people attempt to create a system of analysis that allows for predictive models of analysis of geopolitical developments, despite one's biases. It strives to create an objective framework from which to interpret geopolitics. And although I will argue against this claim to objectivity, I will present realism as faithfully as I can. Realism is a method of seeing and analyzing geopolitics, and not something driven out of any sort of idealism or higher-minded morality. In fact, it is quite the opposite. Realism seeks to ground itself through three guiding principles: that men are self-interested and power-seeking, and therefore that ethics and what ought to be are not good tools to make or predict state policy, and that their natural condition is a state of anarchy. In many ways, shapes and forms, realism has existed for a very long time. In order to justify their starting assumptions, realists often make an appeal to human nature and in particular to history. One such example is Thucydides' famous account of the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides describes as the confrontation between a honor-bound and, in principle, idealist Sparta with the strongest land army against Athens, the sea power, with a practical and cynical approach to diplomacy and war, who distinctly argue that morality has never triumphed over self-interest and superior strength. Debates over ideas, although fictional, litter the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is why it was not simply interpreted as an account of historical facts, but as the start of a theoretical work. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Melian dialogues. in which Athenians seek to capture the small, inconsequential, independent Spartan colony on the Greek island of Melos. I will leave a link to it in the description, as it is a really good read and helps understand, and I'll do a recording of it with a friend for those of you who are too lazy to read, so you can listen to it. The link will be in the description. The Melians, though militarily weak, do not wish to stray from the ideal that they have the right to be an independent and self-organized polity, and believe that the gods and their allies will come to their aid so that what is right and fair may triumph. The Athenians, on the other hand, seek to convince them to face the facts and surrender rather than face their extinction, and make the point that Athens must conquer them as a show of strength, lest it be thought of as weak. Because the Athenians are animated by the purpose of power, which seems to force their hand just for its own sake. In the end, Melos refuses to surrender, and all men of military age are killed, and the rest sold into slavery in one inconsequential skirmish of the war. I personally like using Machiavelli's The Prince to explain realism, written in a time when Italy was dominated by city-states ruled by princes who vied for power and dominance over Italy. Machiavelli wrote that a good ruler cannot be driven by ideals, in particular those of the domineering religious morality, but must engage in the struggles of competing Italian city-states through hard-boiled calculations of what benefits the city-state's position. The prince, in order to succeed, has to therefore engage in actions and policies that may be deemed as morally objectionable or even outright evil. But such objections based on ideals and conceptions of morality are a pointless sideshow and distraction from success in the game of power. The means, therefore, justify the ends in a way. But it would also be a grave misconception to present the realist school as one of people endlessly justifying bloodthirsty conquests and conquerors. There are many historical figures and events that realists like to study as a foundation of interpreting modern geopolitics, and that includes most notably peacemaking. One example is the Napoleonic Wars, in which realists disregard Napoleon and instead praise Metternich. Napoleon, from the realist perspective, is someone who destabilized the balance of European powers, where each one could more or less keep the others in check. He did so by driving French territory and sister republic buffer states deep into Italian, Austro-Hungarian and Russian lands, thereby turning them all against France in coalitions that he could not hope to defeat. Metternich, however, is often regarded by many realists to be an ideal guideline of how to conduct foreign policy. Through hard-boiled calculations, ruthless power politics, the creation of an intricate network of alliances, taking account for the spheres of influence of others while not losing sight of one's own aspirations, Metternich, the de facto ruler of Imperial Austria, despite his country losing the most battles of the Napoleonic Wars, managed to guide the Austrian Empire to coming out on top at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, gaining new territories, securing and expanding its sphere of influence, and making it one of the most powerful powers in Europe despite its internal problems, and most of all, creating a system of power distribution called the Concert of Europe, where every power was so expertly balanced against each other that there would be no major European war for almost a century. Bismarck is another historic figure that realists have much admiration for. His cold and ruthless application of power politics is famous, playing games of power and influence with Austria, Denmark, France and the German states, carefully playing them out against each other, always careful to not overextend and be in a state in which he would be outnumbered by enemies, and transforming Prussia into a German empire, not for an offensive war of conquest, but rather by defensively unifying them against the French in a union so lasting it became its own state. We can learn more by looking at a historical figure for which realists have a lot of scorn and hold up as the worst type of geopolitical leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Because a core foundation of realism is not just an advocacy of cold, hard-boiled power politics with the intention of becoming the strongest power on earth. There may not be rules to game of power politics, but there are limitations. And these limitations are determined by the other players in the game. And if these players can't become the most powerful players, they will go for the second best thing, their own security and existence. As Hegel said, the state has no higher duty than of maintaining itself. Kaiser Wilhelm disregarded these other players, as well as their aspirations and spheres of influence. He managed to threaten simultaneously the French with the Agadir and Tangier crisis, the British with the building of the High Seas Fleet, and the Russians with the unconditional backing of Austria-Hungary, sacking three great powers against him for the price of a single dysfunctional alliance with Austria that was based more on misguided ideals rather than by geopolitical calculations, and another with the sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. In the end, from the realist perspective, Kaiser Wilhelm, who did not appreciate the limitations that were set by other players in the game of powers, managed to unite all the other power players against him and lost what Bismarck had built. So take note of this, because this is something that many fail to understand about realism. Realism is not an instruction manual on how to gain unlimited power and influence based on an unrestrained application of power in geopolitics. Realism also argues for restraint. Realism argues that powers must appreciate that other powers also play the game of power. Realism argues that one should calculate one's geopolitical decisions of foreign policy in appreciation of those informal limitations set by other powers. To put oneself in their shoes before thinking to act to gain advantage, lest you lock each other in an inefficient and avoidable conflict. This very part is a weakness of the realist school. My friend Frog did a very good video presenting that weakness, and he helped me somewhat with this video, so I will leave a link to his video in the description here too. For my outline on realism, I'm going to use the author Hans Morgenthau, who is one of the founding thinkers of modern realism as a school of international relations and geopolitics. This is not to say that he is the only one or the most important. There are many other important realist thinkers. Morgenthau just happens to be the one that I read and am more familiar with, specifically his book, Politics Amongst Nations. Like Thucydides and Machiavelli, Morgenthau argued that all international relations is driven by natural laws of struggles for power between states. His theory is not just descriptive, it has predictions. To formulate and implement effective policy, one should not build it upon one's ideals of what one believes is good for society, but study power dynamics, understand the natural laws that govern power struggles between human beings, and formulate one's policy on what would work most effectively in this power struggle. Morgenthau argued that nation-states are the foundation of all international politics, and that national interests were the main motivations behind all foreign policies, that the desire for and pursuit of raw power, at best to secure the existence and continuation of the state, was the reason for and by which nation-states engaged in the world to enlarge or defend their national interests. Power being defined by Morgenthau as the control over the minds and actions of men, in particular political power as the mutual relations of control among the holders of authority and between the latter and the people at large. Because of the fact that nation-states pursue an expansion of their sphere of influence in competition with others, insecurity and the threat of violence is a constant, ever-present state that will never go away. Hence, the full title of Politics Among Nations, the struggle for power and peace. That is because every nation-state is out there to use whatever means it can to expand its national influence. Additionally, being exclusively defensive in one sphere of influence rather than offensive in growing a sphere of influence does not often work as a means to escape the constant potential for conflict. Because even if every actor was faithfully doing this, any defensive action taken by nation-states could be seen as offensive by its competitors, and therefore produce a counter-defensive action, thereby continuing a cycle of aggression. Realists call this the security dilemma. Morgenthau also argued that national interests are dynamic, meaning they change over time and are influenced by factors such as culture and technology. One has to constantly reevaluate what one's national interests are, for if they change and one doesn't realize this, it is possible to waste enormous resources only to just lose the game of power. Let me give an example. After the end of Mongol rule over China, the Chinese spent almost 600 years fighting and trying to conquer the steppe peoples of Mongolia and Central Asia. It was in their interest at the time. They wished to secure themselves from the invaders of the past, and they wanted to make sure that something like the Mongol conquest of China could never ever happen again. But in doing so for almost 600 years, the Chinese neglected every other geopolitical sphere, such as their eastern neighbors. They neglected their coastlines. They lost spheres of influence over Japan and the rest of Asia. They neglected seafaring. They neglected technological developments in ocean navigation. They neglected new military technologies that were not useful in fighting steppe peoples. They neglected bureaucratic and institutional reforms. They neglected the new economic developments around coastal commerce. And they neglected the resulting cultural and political developments in societies. Consequently, they did not realize the significance of European imperial powers arriving. By the 1780s, the Chinese had successfully conquered and pacified Mongolia, Southeast Siberia, and the eastern parts of Central Asia. But the peoples from these lands who they had conquered and who had, yes, menaced China for almost 2,000 years, had stopped being a threat to China 300 years before. Mongolia was no longer the priority national interest. Instead, the British opium merchants who arrived at the same time along the coast were. China did not realize that its national interests had changed, and consequently, China took a huge loss in the game of power. As this example shows, there is no such thing as a permanent national interest. A nation should not consistently pursue the same goal throughout time, because the environment can substantially change. Therefore, according to Morgenthau, one should continuously study and re-evaluate the national interests of a nation and adapt to changing dynamics of the power game. Morgenthau also argued that any idealism is entirely misplaced, self-limiting and pointless in the study of international politics. Nation-states, groups, communities, and societies may develop concepts of morality and ethics, but a universal application of such systems of ethics is not possible because every moral system must be trickled down to the specifics of any given situation. Nations, therefore, ought to separate their own moral aspirations from ideals of moral universalism, legalism, or sentimentality. Values and concepts of ethics should be strived towards discussion of implementation at home, but have no place on the international stage. The inspiration in historic events that led the political scientist Morgenthau to conclude this were the failure of idealistic international organizations and governing bodies such as the League of Nations in preventing the Second World War. In summary, Morgenthau argued that there are ultimately no ideals or rules that govern international politics and relations. Instead, international politics is driven solely by power politics, and the only rules that exist are informal and created not deliberately, but by the restraints of one's power by other powers. Morgenthau believed that international politics is somewhat like a poker game, that this poker game is played by great powers, such as the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. That these great powers have spheres of influence which contain smaller nation-states, and these smaller nation-states are the chips played in the poker game of geopolitics. Therefore, foreign policy should be driven with a disregard of idealism in favor of cold, hard-boiled calculations of how to play this poker game. But here's the catch. The game never stops. From the realist perspective, nobody can ever win this game. The poker game is assumed to be endless. The poker chips are constantly exchanged in an endless power struggle. Nobody can ever fully enforce their ideals over others, because this power struggle is shaped by cold national interests in power. Great powers may sometimes lose their great power, and thereby lose their spheres of influence to new great powers, but geopolitics will always be dominated by great powers and struggles over their spheres of influence. The potential for violence and escalation, therefore, never stops. The realist also assumes that if all players gang up on one, that one will stand up and draw a gun before losing to everyone. And it is that potential for violent escalation that the realist wants to avoid at all costs, in particular in the post-World War II era of nuclear weapons. Now, let me interrupt here briefly to address something. Many of you will have probably noticed and already pointed out in the comments how similar a lot of this is to the writings of very different thinkers from very different schools, like Habermas, Adorno, Carl Schmitt, Alfred Rosenberg, Julius Evola, Hoppe, or Michel Foucault. The underlying assumption that there are no values, that ideals and ideologies and rules are just lies and excuses, and that all that matters are power dynamics and the game of power. The fact that they all sound so similar is not a coincidence, and neither is it a testimony to the influence of Morgenthau. The reason why they all sound so similar is because of a shared historical experience. It is not a coincidence, but it is also not a conspiracy. They may all sound similar, they may have even partially read each other, but they didn't all conspire somehow to come to and promote similar conclusions. And that is because they all have their origins in the same thing, something called the crisis of modernity. What is the crisis of modernity? In the wake of the Enlightenment, there was a common understanding throughout political schools of thought that humanity could advance and perfect itself through the rational examination of the world it inhabited, bypassing the crude institutions of unjustified tradition and faith that had held society back. There was a frontier to be won, and with it the promise of a perfected civil and moral order for mankind. From that perspective, in 1789, the French Revolution upended 1,000 years of primitive despotism and institutional stagnancy, guided by bold propositions inherited straight from the Enlightenment: universal human rights, freedom, equality and brotherhood, ideals that every contemporary liberal democracy is built upon. A few years into the revolution, Kant published Zum ewigen Frieden, or Toward a Perpetual Peace, a treatise of international relations that is the foundation of a liberal theory of international relations. Concurrently, advances in technology and science enabled the uplifting of standards of living, travel, education, while the abundance of production increasingly melted away the entrenched poverty of the world, together with breakthroughs in medicine and sanitation, such as through the eradication of germs. During this sudden hiccup of years of progress during the 1800s, what had seemed impossible for all of history, the methodical repealing of every horseman of the apocalypse, is made possible through rational examination of the physical world, and it yields many more bounties: knowledge over universal laws, mastery over nature. Hegel, the prime example of this historicism of the 19th century, observed the spreading of the Enlightenment ideas and declared that the realization of human freedom is the ultimate goal of history, and that it will come to be through the creation of the perfect state. When he witnessed Napoleon defeat Prussia at Jena in 1806, he declared that this moment was the end of history. The French had created the political innovation of the nation-state, and all of history as a political development was just a process of achieving what the French had achieved. But that belief in progress through modernity that had so domineered throughout political schools of thought throughout the 1800s was shattered at the beginning of the 20th century. Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, Isonzo, Gallipoli. In the killing fields of the First Global War, where generations experienced mechanized death brought on by technological and scientific development, a war that was promised by those who believed in political progress that it would be the last war, only for their promise to be almost immediately broken by the Second World War, which industrialized the death process and spread it, by design, to civilian populations. It would be a mistake to assume that faith in modernity, which we understand as rationalist drives, was upended merely by the process of applied sciences. Almost every field is confronted at the same time by limitations of pure rationality. In mathematics, there is the foundations crisis, where formalists stand refusing proofs of the intuitionist camp, on the grounds that they require an infinite number of steps that can therefore not be reproduced formally. Yet this is how we proceed to build real numbers. Gödel throws the whole field into disarray when he theorized that the axioms of mathematics can neither be consistent or able to prove all true theories, sending all mathematicians ever since into an exercise of faith in their axiomatic systems. In physics, the quantum realm fractures the discipline into various schools, the schism being still unresolved. Among others, the uncertainty principle, that you can neither know accurately the position or the speed and direction of a particle, raises questions about the limits of rational observation and experimentation. In economics and international relations, paradoxes of rationality forced the injection of psychology in endeavors of formal rationalism, creating behavioralism where an arithmetic of wealth distribution and peacemaking was anticipated. In 1938, Husserl wrote in The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology of a crisis of European humanities, the disproportionate evolution of the hard sciences compared to the humanities. Though mathematical and physical problems may cast doubt upon the role of rationality as a driver of human progress, the worst development is not that the claim to modernity of the sciences is broken, but that the humanities broke before the sciences did. For example, humanity advanced into the nuclear age without the political tools to make humanity's survival in a nuclear age a certainty. And in our day and age, while having still not solved this conundrum of the nuclear age, a second, that of climate change, piles on as the gap between science and the humanities remains. Ironically, centuries before we faced these conundrums, figures of the Enlightenment itself were already aware of this conundrum and warned of it. As the French Renaissance humanist François Rabelais famously wrote, "Science without conscience is but ruin of the soul." Hegel's vision of a perfect state that would end history died in the early 20th century. in struggles and conflicts perpetuated by those who wished to achieve that end of history. What was left in its ashes was not an idealistic striving for modernity, but best described by Churchill, the worst system of government with the exception of all others. Churchill's rashness towards other forms of government stems from the fact that he spent a great deal of his career fighting them. The main political innovation of the 20th century and a direct answer to modernity were the fascist and totalitarian regimes whose main accomplishments were the destruction of idealistic institutions, violent lawless barbarism, and the creation of new crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity. In the Soviet Union, communism, a political force that supposedly would usher in the end of history through a supposedly scientific understanding of humanity and history, ushered in a regime of mass arrests, paranoia, gulags, mass graves, and famines. The fact that these systems, which were always constructed as a rejection of the modern world, not only existed but were able to seriously threaten modernity for the better part of the century was felt as the final traumatic wake-up call from the historicism of modernity for many thinkers, at least those who made it out of the early 20th century alive. Stefan Zweig wrote a very quotable suicide note disguised as a book called The World of Yesterday, in which he reminisces the pre-war world which he adored, from which the fascists drove him because of his ethnicity, and gives an account of the losing fight that he and his fellow intellectuals fought to prevent its methodical destruction during the world wars. My friend Frog recommended me this book, and I highly recommend that book to you as well. Many political thinkers concluded from the horrors from 1914 to 1945 that modernity and the idea of progress was a lie. Almost all of them concluded that what mattered in the end were just power dynamics. The reason all the thinkers I cited earlier sound so similar is because they all have similar origins in a time period in which the concept of modernity and the concept of idealism was questioned. Fascists saw modernity as a manipulation. The Nazis saw it as a Jewish lie. The Nazis specifically believed that what ultimately mattered was competition for resources between races, and the power dynamics of a race war is all that matters. One of the foundational texts of Nazi political theory is Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century, in which he outlines a theory of history as mainly driven by racial struggles and competition for resources. The Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt declared the liberal state to be too weak for the preservation of a functioning social order, declared that all politics was struggles for power between enemies, that all disagreements were ultimately conflicts between enemies, and that therefore a fascist leader must attain absolute power. Carl Schmitt also applied this line of thought in his writings on geopolitics as driven by nothing but ruthless cold power dynamics in which might makes right. And the fascist political theorist Julius Evola wrote in his Revolt Against the Modern World that tradition was inherently a political force that lacked concepts of political theory and therefore contradicted the idea of progress or modernity, which had to be destroyed. Fascism fundamentally advocates for and is an ideology based upon the destruction of modernity and idealism, in favor of a lawlessness of power dynamics. But they were not the pioneers of the crisis of modernity. A century before the Nazis, Johann Gottlieb Fichte spoke a series of speeches, the Addresses to the German Nation, which was an attack against the ideals that the French occupation had imported to Prussia. Fichte in his speeches outlined a concept of the world as a power struggle among races, and in rejection of any ideals of universalism, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. Adorno, Habermas, and Foucault were leftists disillusioned with Marx, because the material conditions for communism that Marx had predicted never came to be. They therefore abandoned the traditional Marxist historical materialism as a driving mechanism of history. They abandoned the concept of progress as well, and instead analyzed history with a focus on groups who had historically been oppressed, be it colonized peoples, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, or sexual minorities. They concluded that there were no ideals or rules, but merely the power dynamics of oppression and liberation from oppression. Hoppe was a student of Habermas, who merely used the same conclusions to advocate for the abolition of any state concept of rules and ideals in favor of a ruthless, lawless, anarchist capitalism. And finally we get to Morgenthau, who came to his conclusions when faced with the rise of the Nazis and even argued explicitly in 1946 that belief in human reason was deficient because of the rise of Nazi Germany. It would be a mistake, though, to think of Morgenthau as a Machiavellian figure instead of a tragic one. Morgenthau was a German liberal and supporter of the Weimar Republic. He lived through its collapse and the rise of fascism throughout Europe. He despaired at this, fled into exile in the United States, where he was confronted with an American unwillingness to face the outbreak of the Second World War and its consequences, right up until those came knocking at Pearl Harbor. He despaired at what he lived through and concluded that what he had witnessed had happened because liberalism and the liberal state were shackled by its own ideals and put in the same danger that had uprooted his life. Morgenthau therefore believed that liberal democracies of the world cannot engage in a foreign policy that is based on liberal ideas, that the liberal power of this world, the United States, must act ruthlessly and often against its own liberal values on the international stage to preserve itself. Contrary to his recommendations, though, Morgenthau did stand up to US foreign policy makers in the name of his own morals on more than one occasion. For instance, he was one of the first academics to object to the Vietnam War. In 1966, in The Purpose of Political Science, Morgenthau wrote that the US had overlearned the lessons of realism and lost sight of the appropriate legal and moral limits to the application of power, and was even fired from his post because of his protest. In the early days of the Cold War, he was an opponent to policies of containment that could frivolously make enemies of the USSR. In the first edition of Politics Among Nations, he argued, "The changed structure of the balance of power has made the hostile opposition of two gigantic power blocks possible, but it has not made it inevitable," and considered a bipolar world having the potential for unheard of good as well as for unprecedented evil. At first he noted that bipolarity would fix in place the balance of power, alliances no longer being able to decisively affect it because of the sheer mass of the two superpowers and their ability to hold states in a bloc even against their will, thus creating spheres of influence. But in the third edition of Politics Amongst Nations, seeing the new bloc of unaligned nations, the experience of the Korean War, he prescribed that Moscow and Washington should adapt their policies to the wishes of their allies if they wanted to draw maximum strength from their support. To summarize his view, the United States are a poker player, Western Europe and South America are its poker chips. The Soviet Union is a poker player, Eastern Europe and Central Asia are its poker chips. And in order to secure a lasting peace, stability and liberal democracy itself, American foreign policy must be focused on securing its own sphere of influence, while parallel to that, not infringing on the Soviet sphere of influence. The end goal of this realist foreign policy is to find and maintain a balance between global powers. You probably already noticed, and you are correct, that realism played an important role in American Cold War foreign policy. After Morgenthau fled to the United States, his ideas were very welcomed among the leading political figures of the United States. Realism became the core foundation of American foreign policy for almost 50 years. It is the reason why the Americans did not intervene or do anything to help Eastern Europeans in anti-communist uprisings. From the realist point of view, these countries were in the Soviet and consequently Russian sphere of influence. Their aspirations for ending communist tyranny were irrelevant. They were in a Russian sphere of influence, and in the interest of maintaining a balance of powers, were left to whatever the Russians wanted to do with them. At the same time, the United States had to be utterly ruthless in maintaining control over its own sphere of influence, from the Cuban blockade to various American-backed military dictators, in order to secure its own sphere of influence. It should be pointed out, though, that realism does not offer some sort of singular objective formula that everyone follows through to the same conclusions. I mentioned before that Morgenthau was fired for protesting the war in Vietnam. There were realists who believed that Vietnam was in the American sphere of influence and crafted the infamous domino theory. But there were also prominent realists like Morgenthau who believed that Vietnam was not in the American sphere of influence. He also did not believe that Vietnam was in a Soviet or Chinese sphere of influence. He believed that Vietnam was fighting a civil war, and even though there was a communist side in this civil war, this did not mean that the Communist Party of Vietnam was aligned to the Soviet Union or Communist China. So, as you can see, realism does come with disagreements amongst realists. The archetype realist statesman, who many realists praise, is Henry Kissinger. He disdained international, idealistic and rules-based organizations such as the United Nations, but still used it for a policy of détente with the Soviet Union to preserve a balance of powers, while ruthlessly playing poker with Chile, Argentina, Vietnam, Syria, Israel, China, India, and Bangladesh over the American sphere of influence, irrespective of what the United Nations may think of it. The Nixon administration was the height of realism being America's foreign policy doctrine. And by the standards of realism, the Nixon administration were expert poker players and are the ideal of what American foreign policy should be. They played Syria and Egypt out against each other to nudge Egypt into an American sphere of influence. They ended communist influence in South America through empowering brutal dictators, and legitimized China as a player on the poker table to then leverage that against the Soviet Union for a policy of entente. And the architect of that realist golden age of American foreign policy was Henry Kissinger. Kissinger's honors dissertations that he wrote as an undergrad at Harvard attacked Kant and Hegel, specifically their notions of there being a process of historical progress. Instead, he argued that history was a continuous, chaotic process of power struggles, where ideological concepts and idealism over societal reform and progress were meaningless. Therefore, in no moral authority, concepts of ethics, no ideology, no religion, and no ideal whatsoever had any guiding role to play. A very nihilistic view, which Kissinger would later mirror as US Secretary of State when he said that the Soviet Union was an ever-present danger to the international world that would continue to exist for centuries to come, and therefore the American public should get used to it, that any striving to end the Soviet Union was pointless, and that instead one should come to terms with the fact that the future would be shaped by a geopolitical game of power and influence with the Soviet Union, in which finding a balance of power would be the ideal foreign policy. Realism continued to dominate American foreign policy right up to the 1980s, when Reagan became US president. Reagan was not a realist, but an idealist. Reagan aggressively pursued the destruction of communist influence, including in places that were considered to be a Soviet sphere of influence, like Afghanistan, East Germany, and Poland. And it is the end of the Cold War where realism faced its greatest challenges, because to many political theorists, the end of the Cold War and the death of communism proved that the realists had been wrong. Under the Bush 41 presidency, a new foreign policy doctrine was formulated from the success of the Reagan administration that saw the United States as the sole superpower, protector of the world's democracies, and the policeman who intervened when undemocratic regimes violated international rules. Bush also wanted Europe to sort out its own affairs and to refocus American attention on building deeper ties and alliances in East Asia instead of Europe. The ultimate goal of this would be in the long term to repeat with China what had happened to the Soviet Union. Under Clinton, the US returned to realism. That may sound surprising to you, but yes, many forget that the Clintons are students of Kissinger. So we saw a return to a foreign policy largely based on realist assumptions under the Clintons. The US had a guiding role over Europe, India was insultingly dismissed as a Russian poker chip, and Russia could do whatever it wanted to do to the Chechens, and most of its neighbors had to tie in line with Russia. Bush 43 was part of a new conservative political school that evolved from Reagan, the neoconservatives. Believing that Reagan's aggressive idealism had ended the Soviet Union, they advocated for an even more aggressive idealism, that America must enforce its ideal globally, and the worst violators must be militarily removed. As much as I want to try to be objective in this video, I think most of us can agree that that one was, in particular, a disaster. Obama was confusing. He basically tried to mix everything. Best example, he was a realist on Assad, who was permitted to massacre entire cities, while being an idealist on Gaddafi for threatening to massacre a city. He supported the Arab Spring, then backed those who undermined it, while doing an Iranian nuclear deal. He claimed to leave Europe to sort out its own affairs, but then he applied a realist foreign policy in Ukraine. Yes, many forget this, despite what Russian propagandists may tell you. In actuality, the Obama administration's policy on Ukraine in 2014 was that Yanukovych should stay in power and that Ukraine should remain in a Russian sphere of influence. Obama basically tried to use every approach and therefore ultimately did not achieve much at all, because his foreign policy lacked focus. Trump was a nationalist isolationist who shunned any and all idealism, but also shunned realist ideas. America had no values to stand for, but America also should not have a sphere of influence, only money to make through defense contracts and trade deals. His foreign policy soured American relations with her ideals-based allies and empowered the world's authoritarians. I personally would argue that a combination of Obama's misguided realism on Ukraine and Trump's isolationism played substantial roles in encouraging Putin to invade Ukraine. And now we have Biden. It is kind of too soon to tell, but I think he is picking up the project of Bush 41. I believe Biden would like the Bush 41 project to be the common bipartisan foreign policy of both American political parties for the rest of this century. Or at least until communist China collapses, since that seems to be its end goal. Realism still exists as a school of foreign relations and geopolitics. It does sometimes get limelight and even influence in American foreign policy. But ever since Reagan, it has to share the table with other foreign policy ideas. In the post-Cold War era, a core tenet of realism has essentially become that the ideologies of the poker players have become irrelevant. The fact that Russia is no longer the Soviet Union is therefore irrelevant. Now that may sound weird to you, but to the modern realist, in many ways, ideology itself is irrelevant, be it the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or the modern Russian state. From the realist perspective, these are just flags. They're just symbols representing a great power or a poker player. In some ways, the ideologies professed by nations are seen as nothing but national makeup or costumes, trends and fads that change with time, while the underlying geopolitical power struggle never changes. From the realist perspective, ideologies do not matter anymore, and whatever ideologies the rulers of Russia claim to believe are irrelevant, because internal political developments do not matter. What matters from the realist perspective is that Russia is a great power, and that great power has a sphere of influence on the poker table that others ought to respect in order to find a balance of powers. And because of that, when looking at the war in Ukraine from the realist perspective, it is the United States who violated the balance of powers by infringing on the Russian sphere of influence through the advancing of democracy in Ukraine. Over the course of the last year, ever since the Russians invaded, and ever since people started posting Mearsheimer clips or repeating his talking points, I have no doubt that we have all seen many enraged Ukrainians, Poles, Finns, Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, Belarusians, Czechs, Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians, and Kazakhs who find realist talks, including those of Mearsheimer, to be almost offensive. I am sure there are some of you in the audience right now as well. From the perspective of Mearsheimer, all of you are in a Russian sphere of influence. And because of that, for America to maintain a balance of powers with Russia, it is in the interest of the United States that Russia gets to have a say in your politics. European realists are also outraged by this. From their realist perspective, Russia has no place in European politics. But European realists often forget that Mearsheimer is not a European realist. He is an American realist. Mearsheimer argues from a position of wanting to preserve an American hegemony as the great power of the Western Hemisphere. And from that perspective, America should try to preserve the status quo of the Cold War. And what you, the European realist, thinks is irrelevant. Mearsheimer does not consider Europe to be a poker player, but merely a bunch of poker chips to be divided between the American and Russian spheres of influence. So, I hope this description of what realism is was objective and accurate. If you believe I failed, you should feel free to point that out in the comments. I look forward to reading them. But with that explanation out of the way, there is something that I need to address, something that is somewhat of an elephant in the room. And it mainly has to do with you, the subscribers. Namely, those of you who asked me to make this video. And that is because most of you specifically asked me to make this video in response to Marxist pundits, publications, and politicians who started repeating realist talking points and posting Mearsheimer clips. I will not do that. I'm sorry, but I believe that doing that would be a waste of time. And if you have watched this video so far, you will probably understand why. These Marxist pundits are basically promoting a political theory that has its origins in American Cold War politics and that argues for an American hegemony over a sphere of influence. And I'm pretty sure that most of them are too stupid to even understand that. If you actually look into what Mearsheimer proposes and not just watch selected clips through confirmation bias, you will find that the reason he opposes Western support to Ukraine is because he believes the Americans should concede Eastern Europe to becoming a Russian sphere of influence as part of a deal America can make with Russia as an alliance against China. I think many Marxist pundits that have posted Mearsheimer clips recently or repeated his talking points don't realize that Mearsheimer is by no means left-wing, but belongs to a political school of old-school conservative American Cold War warriors, a la Nixon and Kissinger. back during the Cold War era, Marxists were in fact some of the harshest critics of realism. They described realism as little more than a thin veneer to disguise imperialism. The very fact that Marxists these days are repeating realist talking points is an absurdity. These modern Marxist pundits of our day and age, to illustrate just how clownish this is, are literally advocating for the foreign policy school that is the cause of the Cuban blockade and Pinochet's coup. You may now understand why I believe that it would be a waste of time to address them or to make this video about them. They are either too stupid to understand what they are advocating, or they are just cynical. When Noam Chomsky, Jeremy Corbyn and Jean-Luc Mélenchon suddenly started arguing a realist position the moment Russia invaded Ukraine, I believe the only time you should waste on them is by pointing out that they are entirely dishonest and cynical. They themselves used to argue against realism, especially concerning the Cuban blockade. If you want to make sense of why they do this, I think you will get a far better insight by looking into something that Chomsky did in 2014. Back then he was given an award for his linguistics work by a Czech university. He then toured the Czech Republic to give various talks. During these he said that the Czechs suffered far less than the South Americans during their military dictatorships, basically arguing that the Czechs were exaggerating how much they suffered under their communist dictatorship and the Soviet occupation. Chomsky, in describing Czech history, magically begins in the 1960s and cuts out the Stalinist era of the 1940s and 50s, during which tens of thousands of Czechs were murdered, as if it never happened. He claimed that the only reason Czech anti-communist dissidents became popular in Czechia was because of an American propaganda conspiracy, that figures such as Václav Havel were basically agents of American imperialism, that they were hypocrites and not true revolutionaries because they were friendly with the United States. Basically, all of Czech history since 1945, the communist coup, the Stalinist purges, the Prague Spring, the thousands murdered and tortured, the period of stagnation, and the struggles of those who resisted it all of it is swept away as one gigantic irrelevancy by Chomsky in one big whataboutism. One can paraphrase Chomsky's attitude towards the Czech people basically with a "I will conveniently erase and ignore the suffering you endured throughout your history, demean and belittle those who resisted your oppressors, and in the end ask, but what about something South America, because you Eastern Europeans are irrelevant brats who are just ungrateful for what the benevolent Soviet Union did for you." If you are European like myself, you probably just know that this is something that you should just not say. Saying something like this to Czechs or Slovaks is just insulting, demeaning, offensive, and an immoral revisionist assault on their identity and self-understanding through their history. Most of us here in Europe know that 30,000 Czechs were murdered under a Soviet occupation, that thousands more were arrested. We know what the Prague Spring was, and how traumatic the Prague Spring and the period of Soviet occupation was for the Czechs. Saying something like what Chomsky said is just out of touch, tone deaf, and offensive. And I think that this is the key to understanding people like him. What people like Chomsky say here, or Corbyn, when he keeps referring to Ukraine as the Ukraine, as if it were still a Russian imperial subject, may remind European viewers of something else. German viewers may be reminded of a certain type of old German who, during conversations about the Second World War, says things like, "Well, at least Hitler built the Autobahn," or "Well, the Poles also did bad things to us, yeah," and try to misrepresent the Second World War as a war of Polish aggression against a supposedly benevolent Nazi Germany. Or French viewers may be reminded of a certain type of old Frenchman who rambles about how the Algerians are just supposedly ungrateful people who do not appreciate all the great benevolent things the French did for them, when thousands of Algerians were burnt alive in their villages by French napalm bombs. And British viewers may be more familiar with a type of old Brit, rambling about the ungrateful Indians who do not appreciate that Britain brought them civilization through famines or something. I believe it is more helpful to understand people like Chomsky, Corbyn and Mélenchon by comparing them to people like that. Western Marxists had a vested interest in the continuation of the Soviet bloc as an ideological competitor to the Western bloc. They believed that the revolution may still come to the West and that the Communist bloc may help facilitate such. But then, the Eastern Europeans dashed these dreams when they did a revolution, ironically against communism, which was supposed to be impossible. Many Western Marxists have never forgiven Eastern Europeans for ending communist tyranny in Europe. I think some Eastern Europeans may not even be aware of that. Your history, your struggles, your cultural identity, your political developments, those are all irrelevant to many Western Marxists. Most of them don't even speak a single one of your languages. The only thing that matters to them is that you committed that cardinal sin in 1989. To them, you are just traitors and ungrateful brats. It is for these reasons that this segment of this video is so short. I know that some of you specifically asked me to critique Marxists who are throwing around realist talking points since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I will not do that. I will argue against the realism of Mearsheimer and Morgenthau because those are genuine realists. I do not believe for a single second that people like Chomsky, Corbyn, or Mélenchon are genuine realists. Realist talking points to them are just temporary rhetorical devices used in a disingenuous way. They are not motivated out of any genuine political principle or theory, but out of a spiteful grudge held against the peoples of Eastern Europe. The only thing that I would have to say to an old British person who claims that Indians do not appreciate what the British Empire supposedly did for them is that the British Empire is dead, and that is a good thing. Now get over it, Grandpa. And in that same vein, the only thing you should say to a Chomsky or a Corbyn is that the Soviet Union is dead, and that is a good thing. Now get over it, Grandpa. So, before I end this segment and go into my critiques of realism, I kind of want to end this segment by quoting someone. Alexander Vondra. He was a Czech dissident during the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia, a leader of the Velvet Revolution, a Czech diplomat who spearheaded the process of historical reconciliation and agreements of future friendship between Poland and Czechia, and is currently a Czech representative in the European Parliament. When Chomsky called people like him cowards in 2014, Alexander Vondra responded with the following. I cannot understand how anybody can respect the reasoning of this poor man. In our country in particular. During the same days when Václav Havel was serving time in a communist prison cell because he advocated for basic democratic values, Chomsky was sitting around Boston cafes, penning articles in full support of Pol Pot's genocide in Cambodia. If the world continues to listen to the bullshitting of such people with an intellectual admiration, we will once again end up in gulags and concentration camps. Now, the next segment are my critiques of realism. First, the Ayatollah disapproves. Ayatollah Khomeini's Iranian Revolution and the resistance against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan were challenges to the bipolar Cold War order that left both sides and their Cold War rationales blindsided. Here, a political system emerged that wished to side with neither participants in the supposed global game of poker. But Islamism also refused to play poker and deliberately played by its own rules outside of the framework of realism. In other words, it was neither a poker chip nor a poker player. It was completely outside of the rationale. Confusing? Let me explain. Realism, as previously explained, is a theory built on the idea of conflict through the striving for power between nation-states. But the political forces unleashed by Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and then further spread throughout various movements and religious sects are forces to whom the nation-state does not matter. Islamism, a modern incarnation of political Islam, is a set of beliefs and system of political organization and institutions that completely disregards the nation-state. It is a system of social organization and political power that seamlessly crosses modern sovereign borders with no regard for any boundaries set by nation-states and any rules of engagement between nation-states. It is a system of politics that exists outside of the concept of the nation-state and can therefore effortlessly operate from outside of the nation-state's constraints. To this very day, no foreign policy theory of engagement by anyone has found a way to effectively confront Islamism as a political force. The main reason is that Islamism is based on ideas and not just a striving for power. To counter ideas, you must confront them with opposing ideas. Additionally, realism, a theory built on a foundation of conflict between nation-states, is utterly useless in confronting political institutions like Islamism, which do not rely on and are not built upon the concept of the nation-state. When confronted with Islamism, realism has helped bring forth some weird curiosities in American foreign policy, such as its alliance with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, theocracies that from the realist perspective may be an American ally, but also actively work on undermining and attacking the American sphere of influence through means that are not bound to nation-state concepts of power games, and therefore cannot be confronted or contained by the strategies and policies of realism. Islamism spreads and builds upon the foundation of an immaterial belief in a God and his supposed cause. Because it is based on faith, Islamism in political terms transcends the nation-state. Nation-state concepts of power such as professional armies, diplomatic rules of engagement, military rules of engagement, or commercial treaties do not matter. The Islamist movement can randomly assemble power from outside of the confines of nation-states from various different national and cultural backgrounds and make moves that violate any and all diplomatic norms. It can set up its base in any power vacuum and also does not care about the rules of engagement between nation-state concepts. Modern Islamism proves that ideologies matter. We do not just strive for raw power and for the exercising of that raw power. No, people strive to act out what they genuinely believe, and Islamism also proves that the nation-state is not the sole force of politics in our modern world. Second, the self-fulfilling prophecy. To most of you who have watched my previous videos, the fact that I am a critic of realism is probably not surprising. I am largely an adherent of institutional economics. I believe that the most deciding factor in political development are institutions, ergo the internal political developments of societies. Institutional economics is about the study of laws, social contracts, and economic structures of the past and present societies to develop policies to improve societies based on what is proven to work through observation and examination. Anyone who studies the development of institutions and believes that there is such a thing as political development by either progress or regression through policy will inevitably come into conflict with the schools of thought spawned by the crisis of modernity. And that includes realism. My biggest gripe with realism is that to the realist, internal developments do not matter and are irrelevant. It is very tempting to adopt offensive realism when looking at the world of geopolitics, to see the world like a nation-building strategy video game. The idea that one can base foreign policy on hard-boiled, rational, and almost mathematical calculations or on predictive models built on observed behaviors, as most modern economists do. Doing so provides a sense of certainty and security. But the way realists boil down politics to nothing more than analyzing power dynamics reminds me of something else. In economics, there is a phenomenon called physics envy. This is when economists pursue the goal of boiling the study of economic success or failure down to hard-boiled rational calculations with predictive power that mimic the predictive power of theories in the natural sciences and ultimately fail. Crafting such models provides a sense of security, but it is ultimately a false sense of security. Numerous economic theories have been built in attempts to create rational mathematical formulas or behavioral models for economic success, which however ignored an incalculable or overlooked social factor and therefore failed to predict an economic crash. To ignore internal social, cultural, and political developments, as realists demand one does, is certain to, and has in the past, ignored enormous social variables that completely disrupt the equation. One of the most glaring things about the previous example of the emergence of Islamism as a political force is that realism was entirely unable to predict it. Not because of a miscalculation through the use of the formula or the pursuit of power among nation states, but because the formula itself is flawed, because it fails to account for internal development. Internal political development, be it cultural, political, demographic, geographic, technological or other, is one of the most deciding factors in understanding geopolitical developments. And many conflicts, which realists would like to explain away as a mere pursuit of power by nation-states, are in fact the result of internal developments. One of the pre-Cold War statesmen, much admired by realists, is Metternich, the foreign minister and de facto ruler of the Habsburg Empire during and after the Napoleonic era. Through a hard-boiled, calculated application of power politics, Metternich managed to become the most powerful statesman in Europe and secure a balance of powers in post-Napoleonic Europe. But from Metternich also comes his famous quote, "You can do many things with a bayonet, but you cannot sit on it." Metternich presided over a police state that attempted to crush and subdue any revolutionary nationalist political sentiment, which happened to be the preeminent force of internal political development of that age. And to do so, he needed a bayonet, which was his police state. But he could never sit on that bayonet. His police state had to continuously subdue internal political developments expressed through the desires of the German people to have a unified nation state, and the various ethnic groups of the empire to have their own nation states. These political developments kept boiling beneath Metternich's bayonet like under a pressure cooker until they finally blew up in 1848, a year of Europe-wide nationalist revolutions known as the Spring of Nations. The Spring of Nations, in return, spawned numerous conflicts, most prominent among which are the German Wars for Unification with Austria, Denmark and France, the Balkan Wars for Independence, Balkan nationalist wars over territory, a Hungarian uprising, several Polish uprisings, the Italian Risorgimento, or Wars for Unification, and they may have also contributed to Arab uprisings against the Ottoman Empire. I would argue that the realist claim of the world inherently being a place of inevitable conflict is in some ways merely a self-fulfilling prophecy in a circular logic that spawns that conflict through its own policies. By ignoring or even subduing internal political development in favor of seeking a balance of powers on a global stage, it enforces a social stagnation that hinders political development, thereby leaving the demand for political development to boil like under a pressure cooker, to later explode to create the very world of conflict that realists insist isn't caused by the process of internal political development that they so deem as irrelevant. Third, the death of communism. I bet most realists are sick and tired of this one, but I had to bring this one up. I'm sorry. But yeah, the era of offensive realism being the predominant force of American foreign policy ended when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War came to an end. Ever since, realism has mostly been confined to being mainly an academic topic of discussion in the field of international politics and in political science. And many realists today put a lot of effort into rebuilding the credibility they lost when the Berlin Wall came crashing down. This is because the collapse of the Soviet Union disproved the core tenet of the realist theory, namely that conflict was an inevitability and that the world would continuously find itself in a state of game of power between leading nation states. Remember Kissinger's justification for his foreign policy, that the United States would find itself in a conflict with the Soviet Union for centuries to come and therefore had to enforce a balance of powers. That was proven false. Previously, I pointed out that ideologies matter. This point is reiterated here through the striving of the various peoples of Eastern Europe to be liberated from the tyranny of communism. But it also shows that the failures of ideologies matters, and that in some ways, the failure of empires and the failure of imperialism matters. The way communism died, collapsing on its internal contradictions by being unable to provide a decent living standard or even just basic dignity to its peoples, on a socio-economic system that was pretty much in decline since the 1970s, showed that nothing about a possible end of communism was an illusion, but in fact something that was desirable and very much achievable. In the end, the idea that the Soviet Union would continue as a geopolitical threat for centuries was the actual illusion. What followed the collapse of the Soviet Union in Europe was an unprecedented era of democratization, peace, and stability, an era in which European nations were able to engage in political development outside of their role of being supposedly American poker chips. And the only reason why we are seeing a return of war to Europe right now is because Russia wants to turn Europe into poker chips, and not because Europe is a bunch of poker chips. The Europeans created the European Union, an institution whose existence is meant to destroy the balance of power games that has drawn this continent into so many catastrophic wars. Rather than striving for spheres of influence and balances of power, European nation-states are encouraged to reconcile, overcome historic enmities, and cooperate. A process successful between Germany and France, Germany and Poland, Germany and the Netherlands, Poland and Ukraine, Italy and Greece, Greece and Bulgaria, Czechia and Poland. Many American realists either pretend the European Union does not exist, argue for its dissolution, or predict its imminent collapse and return to a Cold War era American sphere of influence. There's a good reason for this. The idea of a national cooperation between the poker chips outside of a sphere of influence tears the realist idea of a great poker game of power to shreds. Cold War realists therefore often have contempt for transnational organizations like the European Union, Mercosur, ASEAN, or the African Union. To many Europeans, the political lessons learned from the end of the Cold War is that geopolitical power systems, or spheres of influence and great power, are something to oppose and dismantle. And to those who cannot make sense of geopolitics without these, this idea is often something they just can't get over. Ironically, the realist reaction to the collapse of the Soviet Union was to propose a continuation of realist foreign policy by artificially continuing the potential for conflict between nations and great powers. Some of those proposals were just outright bizarre, to say the least, such as a proposal to artificially prop up and continue the Warsaw Pact to ensure two different competing geopolitical power blocs in Europe, who could then continue to vie for power in Europe and thereby create an artificial balance of powers in Europe between East and West. Basically, a demand to create a potential for conflict and war in Europe, not for any real ideological purpose, but just so that the game of power can continue forever, no matter the cost. Or a really bizarre proposal by John Mearsheimer in 1990 to give an arsenal of nuclear weapons to a unified Germany to create an artificial balance of power between European nuclear powers. Yes, this was actually proposed. This is not a joke. He actually proposed this. Basically to recreate the geopolitical environment that led to the First World War, but with nuclear weapons, and promising that it won't lead to war because there's nuclear weapons. Oh, God. Well, not one realist assumed that European democratization and integration as a process for peace and stability in Europe could actually work. But so far, that process of European integration has proven them wrong. Realism is a foreign policy doctrine of the past. It served in ages of empires and the Cold War. Continuing a realist foreign policy after the Cold War in a post-imperial age would be like for a patient to continue taking addictive painkillers long after the patient has already recovered from a painful injury. Fourth, the empire's missing clothes. This is a point that sort of is an addition to the previous point. Something that is often overlooked today is that the Soviet Union was an empire, and that there's important insights to gain from viewing its history as the history of an empire. All empires are built on lies, and I am not just saying this as some wishy-washy rhetorical device. Empires are built on political fictions, and it is the preservation of these fictions that serve as the justification for empire that all empires invest in. No empire can give you a satisfactory answer to a very simple question. Why? As in, why are you an empire? Or what, to be more precise, gives you the right to subjugate and rule over others? Examine the political foundations of almost all empires in history, and you will never get any satisfactory answer. I bring this up because even though some modern Marxists now repeat realist talking points, ironically the Marxists of the Cold War era had a really good point when they dismissed realism as little more than a thin veneer to disguise imperialism. The same question that you can ask from an empire, you can also ask from a realist. Why should there be great powers? Why should some nation-states merely be poker chips? How do you decide who gets to be a great power? What are the factors that make a great power? Think of Vietnam. Yes, many realists protested the American war in Vietnam, but I believe that a mistake that even those realists made was to see Vietnam as little more than a poker chip that was played by great power poker players. To realists who opposed the Vietnam War, Vietnam was seen as a Chinese poker chip, and therefore they argued that the Americans have to pull out and leave this poker chip for China. But right after the Americans left Vietnam, China invaded Vietnam because Vietnam refused to be a Chinese poker chip. Are countries really poker chips? As we have seen in almost all earlier examples, as much as you may like to assume that some countries are merely poker chips in a game of great powers, almost all countries will universally refuse to be poker chips. And this goes as far back as the Malian dialogue. From the Malians to the Vietnamese, throughout history, idealism consistently persists despite the ambitions of power of those that disregard idealism. Most claims to great power today are built either on claims of ideology or on claims of history. The United States claimed to be the great power of democracy and almost instantly drove that claim into an Iraqi ditch. What possible humanitarian or geopolitical reason could there still be to continue the blockade of Cuba? It is in our day and age really just an unnecessary cruelty. The Chinese claim to be the great power with influence over much of Southeast Asia is based on a bunch of century-old maps, as if nobody else has ever drawn maps before. Some of the most prolific cartographers of the past were medieval Moroccans, so by the standards of China, Morocco has a historical right to rule the entire Mediterranean. The Chinese stories of history of fraternal peoples with Uyghurs and Tibetans is just as much of a hollow fiction as Habsburg fictions of fraternity with the Czech people. And then there's Russia. Russia is an empire state, that being a nation state that attempts to preserve the borders of an empire. And it does so during a time and in a region of dead empires. Russia's claim to spheres of influence in Eastern Europe are in part built on fictions of fraternal peoples that are just as hollow as other fictions of fraternal peoples, but by and large Russia claims that history is the judge that decreed Russia to be a great power. Well, what does history tell us about great powers in Eastern Europe? Turn back the clock 200 years and the predominant great power game for Eastern European power struggles was actually a game of power between Germany, Austria and Russia. Turn back the clock another 100 years and the predominant power in Eastern Europe was Poland. So maybe Russia should bow before its historically legitimate overlords in Warsaw. Turn back the clock another 100 years and Sweden was a great power of Eastern Europe, vying for power with Poland. Turn back the clock another 100 years and the Ottomans were the great power trying to cement their claim over Eastern Europe. Turn the clock back another 200 years and the predominant power of Eastern Europe were the Duchy of Lithuania and the Mongol Golden Horde. Another 200 years and you end up with the Kievan Rus, which is the ancestral state of modern Slavic culture. And if you were to even go further back from there, you end up with Huns, who were also Turkic, then the Goths, who were Germanic, and eventually the Sarmatians and Scythians, who are ancestral peoples of the modern Iranians. If history really is the judge here, then the Iranians have just as much of a legitimate claim than anyone else. Although the Soviet Union was the only imperial entity to unify the entirety of Eastern Europe, it only lasted 70 years. And Russia, or the lands we know as its western core, was throughout much of history a bunch of isolated backwaters, border fortresses, and outposts from where the Kievan Rus, Vikings, and Poles bought the pelts that they sold to the Ottomans. Muscovy started out as a small fortress ruled by a robber baron. A robber baron, by the way, is not an insult, and it is not meant here in the 19th century definition of an industrial oligarch, but a historical term for a type of feudal lord of the Middle Ages. Feudal lords who did not rule over any valuable resources tended to raid the lands of their neighboring lords, or extract tribute from them by threatening violence. And the Prince of Muscovy, who basically ruled over a small backwater fortress in a swamp, was such a robber baron. Any historian will tell you that using a superficial reading of history as a foundational claim of modern political power is a bad idea. It will always lead you to places that prove you wrong. By standards of historical claims, Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Austria, Germany, Mongolia, Turkey, and also Sweden all have just as legitimate a claim to being the predominant power of Eastern Europe, because all of them engaged in policies of conquest and the expansion of spheres of influence to attain that status of empire. History is not a standard by which one can justify claims to empire. History is full of empires that faded into nothing. If history teaches us anything in regard to empire, it is that empire dies. There's a Chechen proverb which claims that the mountains of the Caucasus are white because they are built from the bones of Persians, Greeks, Romans, Goths, Huns, Sarmatians, Arabs, Tatars, Mongols, Turks, and Russians. And it is because of that recorded history of rising and falling empires and all the suffering and misery that came with it that Europe no longer wishes to have any empires or any great powers. But most importantly, it is also why Europe no longer wishes to have any wars. I believe many who are not from Europe often fail to understand this point. The creation of the European Union, the idea of a European cooperation, then competition, is meant as a process to overcome a history of European empires and to build something new in its stead that provides a sharing of resources without having to forcefully construct any spheres of influence. It is precisely for this reason that everyone in Europe, including those outside of the European Union, object and stand in opposition to Russia's invasion of a European country. This is a continent drenched in centuries of blood, and nobody here wants to see a return to European bloodshed. Many non-Europeans were surprised by the eagerness with which many Europeans rallied behind Ukraine. We usually tend to be far less hawkish, so it does not surprise me that this hawkish European response to Russia may surprise a lot of North Americans, South Americans, Asians and Africans. A big reason for a visceral reaction to Russia's invasion is because Russia opened up the specter of something we believe to be long gone and the horror of a distant past, the prospect of a return of European empires. Fifth, the curse of Bismarck. The way I was introduced to realism was ironically through Bismarck. Realists admire Bismarck, and this is something that strikes me as a bit of weird. There's a modern phenomenon, in particular among English speakers, to idolize Bismarck. You may have seen YouTube videos by history YouTubers from the UK or North America who uncritically idolize Bismarck, or you may have even read English-speaking historians who write of him with a degree of praise. This is weird to me and curious because in Germany, the exact opposite is happening. German historians used to write in glowing praise of Bismarck right up to the 1980s. But the common consensus among German-speaking historians today is that Bismarck was a disaster for us. The consequences of Bismarck have been a catastrophe for Germany, for Europe, and for the world. And I agree with this assessment. Bismarck violently ended a German political tradition of negotiation, compromise, and regional autonomy. In its stead, he forced an authoritarian Prussian militarism and its militaristic institutions upon Germany as its political core foundation. His policies of discrimination against the Poles planted seeds for ever deeper resentments, and the foundational myth he created for a unified German state was one conditioned on a vengeful humiliation of France, built on a militaristic identity of the Germans as history's eternal enemies of the French people. I do not understand how realists separate Bismarck from Kaiser Wilhelm, or portray Kaiser Wilhelm as the man who ruined what Bismarck built, because the catastrophic decisions that Wilhelm made were enabled by Bismarck in the first place. Bismarck paved the road into the First World War that Kaiser Wilhelm then marched down. I know military historians have a special romantic image of Prussia, but Prussia was a disaster for everyone. I intend to eventually make a video on the political development of Germany, but just to spoil one thing in advance, look at the worst catastrophes that befell Europe over the last century. They all have their origins in Prussian militarism, in the Prussian political institutions, and in the Prussian striving, calculations, and politics of great power. The way realists separate Bismarck from Wilhelm with a simplified "that is the good one" and "that is the bad one" is just false. Historical developments tie and weave into each other. You can't just pick what you like and dislike as one would do at a salad bar. The selective realist interpretations of history are more often than not simply false. We already went through another realist idol, Metternich, and how Metternich's subduing of internal development points to another failure of realism. But there's something else too. Metternich's Congress of Vienna was supposed to enable a lasting peace in Europe through a balance of powers. Well, did it? The decades after the Vienna Congress were dominated by an Ottoman collapse and an aggressive Russian expansion into the former Ottoman Empire. We also saw the previously mentioned revolutions that occurred across Europe, driven by internal political forces. We saw the Crimean War and its struggle over power and influence in Europe. There was a hyper-aggressive Prussia that went to war with almost all its neighbors and destroyed the faulty balance of powers that Metternich had created, only to replace it with another faulty balance of powers that led into another European catastrophe. This period of balance and peace realists claim existed is overblown and far more complex than they claim. And we often do not even mention how outside of Europe it drove a brutal European colonial expansion and wars throughout the world, which many realists just pretend like they never happened. Realist calculations, though, were one of the main drivers of that colonialism, especially in Africa, where many participants wanted colonies not just for resources, but to undermine the power structures and ambitions of others. The supposed balance of powers and peace in Europe just led to European power players taking out their frustrations on unfortunate peoples outside of Europe. The system of power balance were exported to Africa through the Berlin Conference. They were not previously a part of Africa and were artificially established there through imperial power games by Europe over a power balance. Realists are guilty of something that every single person interpreting history, including myself, is guilty of: selection bias. Anyone who does not admit to this is lying, by the way. And it is the main challenge of all of us who interpret history to be aware of this and to not ignore the historical events that challenge our narratives of interpretation. These were my points of criticism on realism. Feel free to voice your disagreements in the comments. And now at the end of this video, I'd like to share an alternative perspective on the origins of the war in Ukraine, the perspective of internal development. As mentioned before, I come from an almost completely opposing perspective to realism, so it probably does not come as a surprise to you that I disagree with it. Not only am I an idealist, but from my perspective, internal development is the most important factor in political development, and a determining factor also driving geopolitics. As such, I believe that this war was mainly driven by internal forces. When I look at Ukraine, I do not simply see a poker chip that merely exists to be played with by greater powers at their leisure, just as little as Vietnam or Afghanistan were poker chips. As much as you may wish to see Ukraine as just a poker chip, it will refuse to be such, and consequently also refuse to be played as such in any hypothetical game of great powers. I do not believe that the origins of this conflict lie within notions of great power or spheres of influence. I believe the origins of this conflict lie within the internal political and economic developments of institutions in a post-Soviet Europe. As such, I believe the story of this conflict begins with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the death of communism. The collapse of the Soviet bloc saw winners and losers. One of its winners was the Czech Republic. What sets Czechia apart from other former Eastern Bloc countries is that the 90s were dominated by a police crackdown on organized crime and white-collar crime. Czech viewers will probably know that Czechia was attempted to be used as a base by Russian organized crime to facilitate illegal business in Western Europe, most famously through the Russian mafia boss Semyon Mogilevich, who previously operated in Budapest and tried to set up shop in Czechia after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The Czechs, in response, cracked down on and expelled these crime syndicates. And this often overlooked policy measure had an enormous impact and separated the Czechs from other former Eastern Bloc countries, because it prevented the establishment of an oligarchy gaining a Russian-style political influence through its wealth. These Czech anti-white-collar crime policies may have initially been intended to crack down on Russian organized crime, but were also in the end used to crack down on oligarchic structures in general. They therefore had the wider effect of purging Czech institutions of corruption. There are still some figures in Czechia that one could call oligarchs, or kind of oligarchs, such as Andrej Babiš, a Czech business owner who during the communist regime was a spy against anti-communist dissidents, and after communism built a business empire by acquiring a former communist agricultural and chemistry company, Agrofert, and from there expanded to become influential as a right-wing populist political figure. But compared to other Eastern European oligarchs, his power is very limited. He mainly went into politics to save himself and his wealth from ongoing corruption investigations into his various business dealings, rather than to acquire more power. The Czechs, then, without a post-Soviet oligarchy controlling the economy and influencing politics, set out to build open economic and political institutions and managed to build an economic structure that enabled educated professionals and independent entrepreneurs, while also building a functioning, free representative republic that guarantees the liberties of its citizens with separation of powers under rule of law. Prague is seen today as one of the leading cities of the emerging European tech industry, rather than just some shabby corner of Eastern Europe. In fact, the Czechs are increasingly seen as a leading innovator of Europe, and have even overtaken Western European countries in modernization and development. In contrast, one of the post-Soviet collapse's biggest losers was Hungary. In Hungary, corruption and white-collar crime festered deep into the economy and state, thereby creating a system of clientistic favoritism in political institutions. The economy is run by a handful of oligarchs whose wealth is based not so much on entrepreneurship as on favoritism and backroom deals with the state. As an example, the aforementioned Russian mafia boss Semyon Mogilevich was able to continue his business in Budapest during the late 1990s, after being unable to run his crime syndicate in Czechia. In Budapest, he ran human trafficking, illegal prostitution, and finance scam rackets until he had to leave Hungary due to getting the attention of the FBI. Accomplices of Mogilevich, like Alexei Lugokov, were able to continue operating in Hungary after Mogilevich was gone. The Hungarians built a functioning state after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the callousness with which corruption was treated allowed for an oligarchy to be rejuvenated under the rule of Viktor Orban. The state is run by an autocrat who uses the oligarchy to gain far-ranging control of national media to disguise his undermining of independent civic institutions, a system that is only kept from collapsing by European Union subsidies, which the European Union is currently debating if it should cut down. As the leading example of this system, we can use Hungary's richest man, Löring Mészáros. He was a gas station fitter in the 2000s and went from that to being Hungary's richest man within just a few years. But this is not a romantic rags to riches story. Löring Mészáros is a high school friend of Viktor Orban, and that is the source of his wealth. When Orban became prime minister, Mészáros opened a construction company, and his construction company proceeded to receive state contracts for building bridges, stadiums, and other public infrastructure. Löring Mészáros is basically a state-subsidized billionaire created purely through insipid nepotism. Among the winners and losers of the Soviet collapse, Russia and Ukraine both initially fell into the same loser traps. The Soviet-era industries were seized by ruthless and often criminal Soviet-era bureaucrats, who used these to create a clientistic system of favoritism with the state. Throughout the 90s, politics in both Ukraine and Russia was mainly the plaything of oligarchs. However, the big difference between Russian and Ukrainian political development is Putin. When Putin came to power, he managed to subdue the oligarchs in Russia and made these oligarchs subservient to the policies and demands of his newly reinforced, centralized, authoritarian Russian state. A system that is eerily similar to the Kremlinian system of Imperial Russia. But this development in the mid-2000s is where Russia and Ukraine also took different paths. What happened in Russia did not happen in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian wannabe Putins, Kuchma and his successor Viktor Yanukovych, failed at their attempts to subdue the oligarchy and build a centralized authoritarian state. Twice. In 2004 and 10 years later in 2014. Interestingly, Yanukovych was prevented from doing so not by oligarchs but by the Ukrainian public, who did not like the oligarchs but disliked the idea of a centralized authoritarian state even more. Because the establishment of a strongman authoritarianism failed in Ukraine, there's a big contrast between the political development in Russia and Ukraine. In Russia, there was a conflict between the strongman and the oligarchy, which the oligarchy lost, while the Russian public doesn't really have much of a say in politics at all, because there is no politically enfranchised public in Russia. In contrast, in Ukraine, political development, especially since 2004, has been mainly marked by a conflict between an oligarchy and the general Ukrainian public, with the authoritarian strongmen increasingly eliminated from the picture. This is not to say that Ukraine is perfect, but there is a substantial difference in political development here. Ukraine developed a politically enfranchised public. Russia does not have a politically enfranchised public. The predominant internal political struggle of Ukraine is between the public and the oligarchy. The predominant internal political struggle of Russia is between the autocrat and the oligarchy. The Putin regime sometimes refers to Ukraine as an anti-Russia, and in many ways this is actually correct, especially if you rephrase it to Ukraine is an anti-Putin Russia. Both countries in political development made the same mistakes at the beginning of the post-Soviet era. But Russia ended up creating a strongman dictatorship, while Ukraine ended up with an enfranchised public. This is a thorn in the side of the Putin regime. I have no doubt that Putin pursues the conquest of Ukraine out of fantasies of empire as well, but I do believe that the political development of Ukraine also factors in, because Ukraine, as it currently stands, is a window for Russians where they can see what life would be like in a country that is not governed under the Putin system. I'd like to end with a final note on political development in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, some of us unfortunately like to look down at Eastern Europe as backward, as that place that is recovering from communism. Those countries that supposedly have yet to learn to be like us in Western Europe. This is not true. In fact, I would argue that the opposite is true. Eastern Europeans are actually ahead of us in political development. Let me explain to you why I believe this. A core political struggle that we all, not just in Europe, but in democratic societies across the world, face is a confrontation between oligarchy and democracy. Neoliberal policies since the 1980s have generated huge wealth, but they also generated an enormous wealth inequality. Throughout the world's democracies, what we are increasingly seeing is the formation of small, wealthy oligarchies that increasingly challenge the political norms and institutions of liberal democracy. And Eastern Europe, well, they are ahead of us. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, an extreme neoliberal policy of shock therapy was placed upon much of the former communist bloc. In essence, to use a term from gaming, Eastern Europe did a speedrun through the process of creating an oligarchy that we in the West are only just undergoing. The development into an extreme wealth inequality and the development of tying private wealth together with political power happened faster in Eastern Europe, and in many ways Eastern Europe already underwent a development that we in the West are still to face. And once you realize this, then you will also realize that the politics of Eastern European countries is far more important than many assume at first. Figures like Putin, Yanukovych, and Orban are a warning of what can happen when oligarchy wins that struggle. Eastern Europe is not a window into a backward past. It is a window into the political struggles of our future. We should ask ourselves, facing our own struggles in wealth inequality and oligarchy, if we wish to do something more along the lines of what the Czechs did, or end up like Russia under Putin, or do something entirely different. The very political struggle that caused this war, a struggle between oligarchs, strongmen, and the public in Ukraine and Russia, will be something that we could face too. Yanukovych is not some backward Eastern tyrant who could never happen in Western Europe. No, he is a challenge we will face in our future too. And to an extent, we already do. It is eerie to me how Yanukovych's campaign manager was also the campaign manager of Trump and basically imported a post-Soviet methodology of oligarchic power politics into American politics. The reasons for this war are not to be found in Cold War era assumptions of great powers, because the future is not the past. The causes of this conflict lie in the recent past and present politics. Geopolitical conflicts are not spawned through lofty notions of international power games. In this case, they lie in the political developments that are a consequence of oligarchic challenges to public sovereignty. And if you ignore these internal developments, and do not try to learn from them to avoid their consequences, you will doom yourself to facing that very conflict yourself at home. Thank you for watching this video. If you want to discuss this video with the community, do not forget to join our Discord server. Link is in the description. I also very appreciate it when you share my videos around with your friends or on social media with your followers. If you want to support my channel, you can do so by becoming a channel member, or by becoming a patron, or by making a donation via PayPal or Ko-fi. Links are all in the description. Since YouTube has demonetized every video I ever uploaded, and I never made any ad revenue from any of them, any donation from you, no matter how little, is very appreciated. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you all soon again with another video.